morning, world. I'm Steve Rao, the host of Pod TV's World Edition, soon to be a part of the Roku network. And on this show, we welcome you from around the world for our 1 hour where we talk about global affairs, innovation, and what we are continuing to do to navigate through this seemingly never ending pandemic, with the greatest challenge now dealing with the last surge of the Omicron variant. Today, I'm going to begin my monologue very briefly to talk about the societal impact on education. And today, I'm wearing of this pandemic. I'm wearing my Be Believe Become shirt. And we cannot believe, we cannot become anything without an education. And I'm here to tell you today that I'm concerned that in the year 2022, as we begin this year, our children continue to be in crisis. The Omicron variant is raging rampantly. Schools in North Carolina, here where I live, are already talking about virtual learning, canceling classes, canceling extracurricular activities. And we've known in the last 2 years of this pandemic, kids have been in isolation. Gun violence is up, suicides are up. But the thing that concerns me the most is how much we're falling behind in education. Just in the last 2 years, and I'm giving an American perspective, but I'd be curious around the world as to what's going on in your own countries. Online learning fell 60% for low income and minority students. And that number was only 25% for white students in privileged areas in the United States. Children of color and poor communities in the United States lost about 12 months of school last year compared to only a few months for those that are in more privileged communities. And that actually means that these students, when now going into the workforce that have been living through this pandemic, will make about $2,200 less a year when they enter into the workforce. Well, why should we be concerned about this? And why do we want to talk about this today? Well, first of all, it comes down to the global competitiveness that we have in America for education, the impact on our society, why we're working so hard to convince those who are not vaccinated. The longer we keep our kids out of school, the longer that we keep them away from learning in person, we are actually affecting their future for jobs, but also the future competitiveness of our country. Think of this. Mike Bloomberg has actually suggested, the former mayor of New York City, that we should actually eliminate summer break for a few years so that we can get caught up. What I found out in my research before I prepared this monologue is that kids in South Korea and China spend almost 2 more years in school than those kids in the United States. And that was before COVID. Many kids who haven't been able to complete their online education, who do not have broadband or internet access, have dropped out of the system. Millions of students no longer exist in our system. If we are going to give our children the ability to be, the ability to believe, and the ability to become anything they want to be, and propel the United States as a continued leader in the world economy, we must invest in our education now. We have to balance the trade-off between keeping those who are getting sick from COVID at a time when 85% of new infections and deaths are from those over the age of 65 in our country and around the world. This is a conversation I'd like to have today about the impact of education. What will be the future of education in a post-COVID world if we can transform this pandemic into an endemic and get through the final surge of the Omicron variant? With us today, we have Mark Lee, my co-host. We have Sasha Starr, the host of Chess Stars and Modern Investing with Sasha. We have Mark Thimick, a special guest who we're going to introduce in a minute, who's going to be talking about esports. And I know that esports, in fact, as a city councilor in where I live, in the city that I live, we're talking about esports as a way of keeping kids active. And we've actually partnered with Community College System right now to actually bring esports in to our Parks and Rec department. So we want to welcome him to the show as well. Well, gentlemen, that was my quick monologue about education, an issue that we don't talk enough about. But I do think it's concerning to me that our kids are spending less time in school, and the less time they spend in school, someone else around the world is spending more time in school. I'd be curious as to what's going on in Canada with schooling. And Mark, what's your perspective about what I said, particularly about low-income and minority students not getting the same kind of opportunities as privileged students in the U.S.?
Okay, in Canada, education, you can divide it basically in two. One is education as to purpose being develop a well-rounded person who would be exposed to classical education, uh, uh, different language, music, arts program, and so on. So they would be well-rounded, educated people. Number two, there is education as an extremely competitive process, which would allow you, if you're successful, is to get on the top of the crop and get into medical school or so on and on. It's extremely competitive. It's very aggravating because people who are near the top, not at the top, but near the top, unfortunately, they are being squashed because they are not going to be accepted in medical school or law school or anywhere else. So they will end up, while having quite successfully managed their education process and all family and parents and everybody else support them, unfortunately, they will have to settle for much lesser jobs in the future, and they might be very unhappy about that. But that's a fact of life. That's unavoidable, and sometimes you may think that is education really for everybody? That's a question that definitely has to be answered.
Yeah, exactly. And the reason, and we're going to bring Mark's perspective in before we introduce him and talk about esports. But the point I was, Sasha, thank you for that perspective. And the point I was trying to make is there's always trade offs, right? I mean, we want to make sure those that are not vaccinated are staying isolated and keeping us safe. But at the same time, we are, changing education for now 2 years, and we haven't often talked about what that's meant to the impact of our children around the world. And the fact of the matter is that if you don't have internet access, you don't have access to online education, and these kids are dropping out of the system. And I found it intriguing that at least in China and South Korea, our kids are spending 2 more years in school than those in the United States. So, is it any question that our test scores down here have gone down compared to these other countries? Mark, what's your perspective about that in terms of just the economic potential that they're losing as they go in the workforce? And I brought up other issues about gun violence, suicide, isolation. I mean, the numbers are clearly showing that kids are falling behind in all these areas.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. The kids are falling behind. I know that my nephews are definitely still engaged in their other out of school activities like football and some of the other things that they are engaged in. And we're glad to see that they were able to do that once again. But like you said, there's been some questions about whether it will be some in school classes, virtual classes, or a number of other ways that those classes will be taking place and things of that nature as this new variant takes place and all of that. So we are definitely monitoring that. I mean, my brother is monitoring more since he is his kids and everything. But definitely, I as a good uncle am interested in what goes on with their education as well. So definitely, I have some concerns about that also, and know that they just came back recently from a winter trip, so they actually got a chance to go to the beach, and now we're back home and getting ready for the school to start back and get back into the groove and all of that. Now that it's that time of year for the kids to get back into their schooling and to definitely try to have that education that we want them to have and all of that. By the way, I do know that Nick, who said that he was watching and definitely wanted us to acknowledge that we have, and Sasha will be glad to know this, a listener that was from the Ukraine. So apparently, Elena Dillingham, I guess she did this on yesterday, had put out that she liked the World Edition and was definitely wanted us to acknowledge the fact that she is one of our fans. So definitely, Elena Dillingham, we appreciate you watching and giving us your support and all of that. And I'll be trying to see if anybody else gives us those likes and lets us know that they are watching as well. Always glad when we are knowing that we are going around the world. We know that we've definitely been going out to Al Jazeera and Lithuania and a number of other parts of the globe as well. So it's always glad to see that these folks are definitely enjoying our conversation about what is happening in the world.
So
As
we
you
have,
can see, we've also
yeah,
got
yeah.
Mark Themick here as well, and I know that Mark Themick is involved in a couple of things, including some things that you mentioned and everything. And definitely, I would love to hear his thoughts about esports, and definitely around the COVID testing, which is definitely an important issue in these days. But I guess we'll start off with esports, since, as you said, Steve, a lot of people in this time have been going more into the virtual world, whether that's esports, whether that's metaverses, whether that's a number of other things. But they are trying to find ways, for lack of a better term, to escape what's going on. I know that, as I've mentioned on this show before, during Thanksgiving, and I imagine he was doing it even during that winter trip down to the beach, one of my nephews had on his set so that he could enjoy some of his games in that whole virtual reality, augmented reality kind of space and everything. So we know that those are very popular. Young kids are getting them and everything. They're not the cheapest things in the world, but they're not the most expensive either. But I was just wondering your thoughts around esports and some of these headsets that are out there, and just the popularity of esports. Mark Thimick, I know that esports is very popular.
Well, yeah, I'd like to actually touch base on three things. I'd certainly to talk a little bit about the sports and gaming community and world, and how this whole Corona COVID issue is affecting that. But I also spent a number of years in charter school education. I built 57 schools, 7 states, had over 22,000 students in my schools, mostly urban inner city, and we were the largest at-risk dropout high school educational program in the country. So I'd like to touch base a little bit on what Steve was talking about, because I had a tremendous amount of experience with urban inner city kids, with minority kids. We were primarily what we call 97% free lunch kids. Those are the kids in most poverty. And the dropouts, of course, were also kids struggling with drug addiction and many other issues, alcohol, drug addiction, and so on. And I think what I'd like to maybe touch the education first and then kind of get into the other pieces. But it has always concerned me with COVID. There are many, many homes in these urban cities with minority kids and just poor kids that their parents are not educated sufficiently to provide a academic structure, a reinforcement of an academic structure. Many of them have never graduated even high school. So we're talking about an entire generation potentially of urban inner city kids and at-risk kids, and even their kids spread around the world and that don't have access to, the education system where there's a teacher who is leading the learning process and trying to assess, while they do that, the students and what is needed for each student, and then to try to give them. That's what great teachers typically do. The other thing that's important is that in many urban inner city communities and homes, because the parents have not had the benefit of completing education, they actually lack even an extensive vocabulary. So what you have is kids growing up and without being in school where vocabulary is a part of learning, they're in an environment where there are fewer spoken words and there are fewer articulated words, and their vocabularies don't develop, and also their ability over time as a child is now damaged to really progress in education. So there's some things that have gone on, for a lot of years, but schools have been brought in remediation, they brought in teaching techniques, they brought technology in, face up, and so on. So I wanted to just touch that briefly, because we do have a serious, Steve, you're absolutely right, we have a very serious problem, K through 12, but also now in college. There are a lot of kids who could go to distance learning college, but they go to college in part to be part of that community and part of that relationship and network that they find in college with classmates and roommates and so on. So that's just the first few thoughts on education. In the esports world, it just has grown and magnified, because it's not only about playing games. And it's important that parents understand that it's about community. It's about building relationships. It is their social network. And I've seen kids, when they can't get on those games and talk to their friends, to become, very depressed and they're not accustomed to being all alone, many kids. So this allows them to sort of be alone yet be in community. And they often talk about every imaginable range of things while they're gaming. So that is a really important part of what is there. And then finally, the last point, and I don't want to take too much time here, but the issue of testing now, I want to touch base briefly on that. We're in a situation where we used to have rules that said if you were vaccinated, you don't need to be tested, or if you're not vaccinated, you need to test. Now we're in a world where we found out that you can, in fact, get this virus, this new virus, whether you're vaccinated or not. Apparently, people are coming down with that. There's wide reports of that. So now we're saying, well, we've got to start testing people regardless of their vaccination status. And unfortunately, what's happening in the testing world for a lot of people that want tests, they can't get them, in part because their private industry is in competition with government. You have the federal government, you have the military, you have states, you have cities, all competing to buy up test kits. So one of the things that I've gotten involved in and could help any of your viewers that are interested in large quantities, 100,000s to multi-million test kits, I can help people acquire those test kits at competitive costs and allow them to provide those to whatever there is, whether it's a retail community, whether it's a university or a school, or whatever that community might be. There is this huge need for these tests, because it's not that you take one test and you're done. We're going to need to be having multiple tests depending on how active people are in society, how much they're traveling, how much they're out in restaurants and communities, because of the viral nature of this spread here is so dramatic. So I wanted to just make that point that there's a massive demand well beyond the supply. But there are certain people, I have access directly to the manufacturers and the title holders of these tests, and we can provide those. So I think we're going to have this complicated back to school regime that's also going to include testing. We're going to have a back to work scheme that's going to include testing. And this is not going to go away anytime soon from what all we can see is the observation. So I'll leave it at that and stop.
Yeah, turn it back over to Steve and everything. Hey, Steve, one of the things and I've neglected to mention this, is that Mark Themick is from Houston, and I know that one of the issues that we've talked about, and I don't know if you've got any thoughts about it, but it's definitely an issue that has impacted Houston and the world, even Toronto, where Sasha is and everything, is immigration. So maybe we want to pivot to immigration or climate, because I definitely know that there have been some new studies around climate change, also saying that climate change might bring more hurricanes to New York and other mid-latitude cities, according to a recent study. So I know we just had a big storm here, and it literally knocked a big tree out behind my house. So if y'all heard a chainsaw earlier, that might be them cutting down the tree that fell down and everything along those lines.
Well, before we do, I'd like to get Sasha's response to what Mark said. I had a question for Mark, but Sasha, do you have any perspective to share with us on what Mark said about testing? And
I think the situation is actually much worse than we can even imagine. If priorities are, what is it, number one, what is it, health or education? Because sometimes people would have to make a choice. You cannot have both. You will have to choose what is your priority. Because right now there are already cases where this Omicron is merging with a flu type of virus. And that combination is really horrible because it has all virtues of both, and yet it's viral. And there are already cases, including death, from this new development. And in this situation, it's hard even to say. Number one, people always believed, and rightly so, that once you got infected with the coronavirus, whether it was alpha at the beginning, and if you are lucky to survive, you would have antibodies that would prevent you from further infections. Now, this Omicron and this new combination, it's not even clear whether there is any immunity, and antibodies, of course, are being developed. There is no evidence of that. So you can get sick with Omicron, get back on your feet in, say, a few days, 5 days, quite often, and then 2 weeks later get just another infection, which could be maybe even stronger than the first one, or maybe less so. But it's unclear. Right now, there is no data. So in this case, if your priority is to avoid this development and not to get sick, you must stay home, period. The end of
Yeah, and I think that's the trade-off. And I have a quick follow-up question to that. And that's what I was trying to say in my monologue, Sasha. It's hard when you only have 2 minutes to open up, but there's a trade-off. I mean, Sasha, you put it so well. There's a trade-off between keeping those that are not vaccinated healthy versus the trade-off on the impact on society, both short-term and long-term. And that's a conversation we haven't really had is, you know, where do you make that line between health and education? And as Mark was saying, in inner cities where you have kids that are not, that are poor, that are underprivileged, that are minority communities, that don't have access to internet, they're not going to be able to learn. And by keeping them at home, what's in it, and this is a good segue into my next question about esports. Some of the data shows that gun shootings were up 42% in 42 more gun deaths in the U.S. school shootings. Suicide rates are up 51% among youth between 12 and 17. Does esports, Mark, help with dealing with the isolation, at least keeping these kids active? So if they're having challenges with schooling, they don't go into some kind of a depression where they just get into bad things like that.
Yeah, it's a great point, Steve, you bring up, and I wanted to address it with actually 2 points. One, it is an opportunity to have an active social community. So that addresses some of the stress and depression and isolation issues that children face. The other thing I think is important, and I didn't mention it earlier, but I'd like to because it ties in with education, the theme of this, is that many of the esports games and games online have a substantial number of STEM skills that are part of the game. So when kids are gaming, they're not just wasting time. They're learning how to work together in many games. They're learning how to strategize. They're reading. They're learning rules. They're learning, in some cases, math is really important to calculate things. They're learning eye-hand coordination. So they're actually skill building benefits that a lot of people don't realize. They look at a kid playing a game and they think there's nothing to it and they're not learning anything. In fact, they're learning many things. And so I think that's one thing that is an additional advantage to do it. Now, I would also just say that, anything that's done for too many hours is not good. So, if your kid is playing, games for 12, 14 hours a day, that's probably not the best situation for them. So there should be some boundaries depending on age and structure and so on, that work with, coincide with parental supervision over, gaming itself. So that would be the only other thing I would say.
Hey, just really quickly, Mark and everything.
Thank you, Mark.
I was just curious. When I think of storms, I usually think of Hurricane Alley. There's no doubt that Houston, New Orleans, and a lot of those others are in kind of that Hurricane Alley. And I know that when I was a youngster, I'd actually thought about being a weatherman. So I'm hearing some reports that they're saying that big cities around the world might be having to deal with this kind of weather that y'all have been dealing with for decades and everything. And I was just wondering, as one that has lived there, I think, for a number of years, if you think that places like New York, Boston, and even Shanghai are prepared to deal with what y'all have had to deal with for decades. Because, like I said, whenever I have historically looked at hurricanes, definitely North Carolina's been hit by them, but y'all get hit regularly down there in Texas and Louisiana and places like that. But now they're saying that the Mid-Atlantic could be getting more of these because, and they're blaming it to some degree on climate change. They're also saying that the mild weather could be some of the also an impact of what we are going through in that climate change as well, because this has been up until now. I mean, we did have snow yesterday in North Carolina. This has been a relatively mild winter and everything, and a relatively mild fall. But I'd love to just hear your thoughts as to whether you even think that the nation is prepared for it if it makes a shift as to where the hurricanes go.
Well, I'm not an expert in that area, but what I can tell you, having lived in Texas for a few years, we almost lost our entire power grid last year. We had massive power outages. We had water outages because our power grid system was not designed or set up for cold weather, for freezing. And we got into a severe weather condition, and it almost destroyed the entire power grid. Literally was saved in a matter of seconds, not minutes or hours. And so I think there's a lot of concern of a broader impact of what just extreme cold weather or a significant change from one end to the other, heat or cold, can do to communities. And we're still finding that out. So that was just, one observation about what can happen.
Yeah, definitely.
Right. I mean, that's, and so are there any other, so Mark, yeah, real quickly about East Point. So we are working where I'm, those of
Steve, I'm
you
losing you.
around
I
the
think.
world.
Yeah,
Uh,
Steve, it sounds like
They're
you're breaking
losing
up.
them.
senior member.
Yeah, Steve seems like he's
So,
breaking
okay,
up and
Steve,
everything because we're not
let me just interject something about the climate changing. Actually, Toronto is a big beneficiary of the climate change because the temperatures are getting warmer each year. And this winter is beautiful. It's very mild. It's a lot of sunny days. It's a plus 4 or 5 Celsius, although today is a little bit colder. So it's first winter, as I remember, that I can go out and smoke cigar without worrying being cold or anything. However, let me tell you something. That's probably I will not make you happy about something. I think it's a little too little too late worry now about the climate change. First of all, it's very important that we will be all well and alive by the end of February, because right now there is at least 50% chance of a conventional war in Europe, and there is a 50% of 50%, so I can call it 25% overall, that there will be a nuclear war. Simply not, nobody wants to have nuclear war. There were memorandum issued by Russia and Western powers that they're trying to calm each other down and saying that even if there will be a war, let's not make it nuclear war or so on. But you know that any unintentional mistake, never mind intentional one, any type of situation where one side will be threatened that it's actually losing the war, obviously it will consider to use nuclear forces. So right now, until the end of February, I would require a caution from everybody. Let's not even discuss climate change, because in the event of war, especially a nuclear war, it's non-event.
I hear you, Sasha. Along those same lines and everything, because I know that you brought this up several times, because I know what you would like to have happen in terms of certain trials and certain things going on and everything. But, earlier today, there was a report, and, we're coming up on a significant anniversary of a attack
Yeah.
on the government and everything. But apparently, there has been a new poll out that says that the amount of the folks that supported the past president has risen as to the amount of those that believe that the election was rigged and stolen. So today, a full three-quarters of his voters, 75%, believe that the election was rigged and stolen, and that's just 9%. Meanwhile, think Biden won fair and square, which is down from 13% last January. So I'd love to hear from all of y'all. Do we need to be concerned with those kind of statistics if more and more people are having a severe distrust of the government based on what they may have wanted to happen in the
Well,
results
I
of
think,
the election?
and I'll take a shot at that. I mean, I think Fareed Zakaria is having a show. I think next Sunday on the state of democracy in the United States. I think it's on Sunday at 9. And should we be concerned? My statement is not as I'm a moderate Democrat. I have many Republican supporters, but I speak as an American, just giving an American perspective that I do think we should be concerned about the strength of our democracy, that we need to be able to honor the outcomes of elections. And we need to make sure that there is a transfer of power and that we use the elections as a way to have those debates in as a respectful manner as possible. I think the social media has made it very hard to do that because it's flamed. Before you had social media 10, 12, 14 years ago, people would have disagreements in op-eds in newspapers, debates, but they wouldn't be able to just go and say whatever they wanted and post it online, versus other things. And I've witnessed this myself over the last decade being an elected official, that people who don't support you can put up absolute untruths online, and they can pay for an ad and send it to thousands of people, right? And they
Yeah.
can block you. They can block you from going and defending your position, and then they sell it as the truth. Now, this is happening on both sides, right? So, Mark, to answer your question, I do think we should be concerned that both parties in America, they say we're right, and and then democracy is weakened because what's going to stop them if we can't honor the outcome of an election? Then moving forward, any president who's elected will say they didn't win the election.
Hey,
And
Mr.
anyway,
Simic, and I don't know what
yeah.
your own political viewpoints are. That's never come up in the conversations that I recall us having and everything. But I'm just wondering, you're definitely in a contentious state. I mean, that state, Houston, has definitely been in the news with everything from Roe versus Wade to immigration to a number of other things. And before the 2020 election, nearly two-thirds of Americans said they at least trusted their own state to accurately count the votes in the next presidential election. And since then, even that number has fallen 10 points to 53%. So I'm just wondering, as one that's in a state that is very much in the news, oftentimes around contentious issues like immigration, like Roe versus Wade, like even vaccine mandates, and a number of other things, what your own thoughts were based on what you've seen. And I know you're involved more in esports, but you are a resident of Texas. So I was just loving to hear what maybe some of your own perspective is.
Yeah, Texas is a very interesting state because we have a very strong Republican and very strong Democrat cities. Houston and Austin lean more Democrat. Other parts of the state lean more Republican. I just saw a report this morning that Texas, Houston, actually in Texas, has seen more than 150 people killed by suspects out on bonds. So that's a whole nother issue in itself, where we have certain district attorneys who have a different philosophy about, holding felons versus granting them bonds. And so we have that issue. So I think we're in a situation right now where there's been a lot of misinformation, miscommunication, that in fact, the government itself has been party to. We have certain people that are responsible to talk about COVID. They keep varying their positions and opinions. It's not clear whether they're science-based, politics-based, economics-based. So I think this whole environment that we're in today across multiple issues, whether it's immigration, whether it's crime, whether it's the economy, etc., supply chain, and so on. All of these things are coming together, but they all have different sides and points of view. And then you have people that promote one thing, say wearing a mask, and then they have pictures of that person, not wearing a mask in big crowds, and this kind of constant misinformation or misdirection, or for you but not for me, is a problem. And I think we have a very confused population today as to who's right, who's wrong, or what to do.
Exactly. What's happening right now, as I said many times before, that you have basically half and half population split in United States, where one half believes that the Earth is flat and convinced that it cannot be otherwise. Now, the other side believes that the Earth, in fact, is not flat. It's either a round, it's like a ball, and it cannot be otherwise. So there is no reconciliation between these two points of view, and you cannot exist in the same society, in the same country, where you have so opposite views on the world. So I think that the only way to reconcile that is a war, and one side has to soundly defeat the other side. I don't care even if the side which believes that the earth is flat will be victorious, that's fine. So now all people in the United States will live under the belief that the earth is flat. And if everybody believes that the earth is flat, let it be so, until people one day will be awoken that in fact they've been wrong. Now, after they defeated the opposite side and now they rule the country, now they will be awoken to idea that after all they were wrong. And that's possible outcome. And of course, if it will be a big war in Europe, whether nuclear or not, that would also help to take care of all these issues that I don't believe can be reconciled peacefully.
Yeah, I mean, we're more divided, and I think Mark, you brought up some good points. I mean, I think that we're more divided than we've ever been in the U.S., and our system is not a coalition-based political system like many other countries. So it's really, political parties used to be about building coalitions within those parties. Even if you look at the history of our country in areas like civil rights, voting rights, you had to bring in the Southern Dixiecrats with the Northern Democrats to bring in, when Lyndon Johnson was president, all these different factions, and that's how policy was made. But today, what's happened is you either have the left, progressives, you have the right, the middle is really left out of the conversation. Joe Manchin's getting a lot of attention from my home state of West Virginia because he's sort of the swing vote on many of these issues. But until we get back to having policy debates, like for example, Senator Schumer now is threatening to change filibuster rules if the Republicans don't pass voting rights bills, right? So it's that kind of aggressive negotiations that you know make either party really upset. They make it out. This is from masking to vaccination to returning to schools, to foreign policy, healthcare, infrastructure, social infrastructure bill. All of these issues are now so divided, and each side believes, well, I'm right, you know. And if they don't get the outcome that they want, then they go, well, the election was rigged. We have to claim what is ours.
Hey, Steve.
But wouldn't you agree that it's better to have a bad rule than no rule at all? So for example, when Putin has talks with Biden, Putin is essentially a tsar of Russia, and many smaller republics who are one way or another are going along with Russian policies. And who is Biden? He is a president? Oh, he won the election? Really? And in 2 years, he may lose all his power if he will lose interim elections in Senate and House. And in 24, he will lose probably the presidential
And
election. Then he's nobody.
and before Mark, go ahead. But go
Yeah,
ahead.
I just want to pick up on your earlier focus on the program too. In a simple way, I grew up understanding or being taught that education is the foundation of a free democracy, of a free democratic country. So when we look at the destruction of our education system right now, which Sasha has commented on, and Mark and you have, we're actually destroying the foundation of our democracy. And we've got people, teenagers and young people, have no idea what the future, I mean, what the past of this country really was all about, and why people fought for it, and all of those kinds of things. What was freedom fought for, and so on. So their willingness to give up what they never really possibly understood well is a concern. I do think there's a lot of young people who don't really understand what a great country they are in, and so they can be misled so much easier with enticing speech about something that could be given to them, or eliminate their debts for education, et cetera, et cetera. So I worry that our education system also damages the foundation of our entire democracy. Markley, I wonder what your thoughts are as well on that too, and Sasha.
No, we actually hearing what you were saying and everything. And actually, I was as y'all were talking, I was looking up some statistics, and there's some things that are actually kind of a mixed bag that are going on. I know that on this show, me and Sasha and others have talked about the fact that there are a lot of restaurants and businesses around that are saying that they're having a hard time because of the pandemic finding people to fill the jobs that they need and things along that line. But the flip side of that is that there are a record 4.5 million American workers that quit their jobs in November. And a lot, of course, the economic people and the economic folks at the Labor Department and others are seeing that as a sign that things are improving. So I'm going like, on one hand, we've got a lot of people that are like, I don't want to work anymore, or I'm quitting my job, I'm leaving my job. But then we've got a number of other types of jobs that are having a hard time even finding enough employees to do their work. I know that it's definitely impacted the restaurant businesses. I don't live that far from some restaurants, and there are some that have even shortened their hours and or definitely been trying to find unique ways to get more staff. So I don't know if that's going on in Canada or other parts of the globe, but I was just wondering anybody's thoughts about this, because it's like we're getting mixed economical news as we're fighting this Omicron variant. And I was wondering if there's any thoughts about that.
Well, real quickly, but go ahead, Shaza.
Okay, in Canada, the situation is quite similar to the United States, that people were provided with all kind of financial reliefs during the pandemic, and that kills any desire for these people to get engaged in any kind of employment situation. So if they are getting a couple of $1,000s a month for doing nothing, plus they have some savings, and if they are, say, middle class, who have access to, say, $250,000, and they can make some profits, let's see, in investing from the stock market, actually there is no need for them to work anytime soon. They may live for next 5, 10, maybe even much longer years without any employment whatsoever, especially if this pandemic relief will continue much longer, and it could. So we don't know really what's in store. So that would dictate higher wages. That would fuel the, of course, inflation, and that's how the stock market gains will evaporate very quickly. So maybe
Yes. Well,
they will join the workforce.
so I think real quickly, Mark, and then I had some insight to share. I mean, are you asking about we know this, are you just asking about the economics?
Right.
In terms of,
And we're
yeah,
asking about the economics. And I mean, even what Sasha said, in the theory, that sounds wonderful if that many people have that much money, that if they get the additional money, whether that was $1,400 or whether that was a series of a couple of $1,400 and some, I think there was a $600 check in there in the way
Oh,
as well. But in theory, that sounds great. But most people that I know, and I know that that's a personal reflection, but most people that I know had a hard enough time, and these are sometimes just acquaintances. They're not even friends, getting like $300 to $400 to survive on. So I mean, the extra
well,
$3,000 could have helped, but I don't know that it would have helped for much longer than a couple of months.
well, I think
Everything of that
downtown.
nature.
Well, I think that we sort of navigate. I mean, stock market continues to be good. Unemployment is down relatively speaking, but at the end of the day, you have the return to downtowns, like in terms of restaurants and retail. I don't know where it is in Texas. Those are struggling with more takeout orders and stuff like that. So the small businesses, how are they going to recover in a post-COVID world? What's going to happen with the commercial real estate space when people aren't going to want to build the high rises or go back if people are never comfortable going back to work? Are we going to go back to work? Um, Kimberly's going to be joining us in a minute.
Yeah, Kimberly's
And
just going to
so
join us. We're going to bring her
economically,
in just so you know we like to.
I think that we're living in a new world and we don't know what the new normal is going to be like. But one final point I'll make, as we talked about political division in America, the other point is while we're continuing to be divided, on Thursday we're going to be talking about the insurrection, the 1 year anniversary of the Capitol riots. The leaders of China are looking at this saying, look, even though the US has the strongest economy, even though the US has the strongest military, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to unite China, to crack down on capitalism, to have the government control, to increase space satellites, to increase nuclear power so that we can be the superpower. And so, as other countries are watching this political division, right, and are using it to their advantage, even though we are economically still the strongest country in the world and militarily the strongest country in the world, right? We've got the leader of China now becoming our superpower enemy, right? Kimberly,
Yeah, there's
welcome
no
to the
doubt
show.
about that. And that's what I was actually going to tie in to Kimberly and one of her passion projects. And it's actually something that I know Mark Themick has alluded to as well and everything. But I know that Kimberly was involved in the early ways of getting broadband and broadband access to a lot of places that didn't always have access, including some of our minority communities, because she's brought this up a couple of times on the shows and things along that line. So I'd love to hear her thoughts about what we can do to make sure that broadband and internet, so that people like Mark Themick can have their esports accessibility into those poor communities and things along that line. And before you enter Kimberly and everything, I was going to mention that Canon Israelite is listening and watching. So definitely wanted to thank them for listening and watching. Don't know where because it doesn't tell me that. So if Canon Israelite wants to let us know where they are at, then we would love to know that as well, because we did have a listener from the Ukraine that put out a like, and this one put out a heart symbol. So apparently they were loving what we were doing and all of that. So we want to welcome Canon Israelite to our audience and all along those lines. But Kimberly, your thoughts about broadband and how we can get it to more minority communities?
Okay, thank you, Mark. Yeah, I'm going to address that, but real quick, I think that Steve had directed a question towards me too about the presidential issues and everything. And I've been listening, especially while on the road a lot, to a lot of the radio talk shows about what had happened, what's going to go on, and what our future is. And it's quite interesting how people predict things. And you could listen to both sides of the track, and maybe somewhere down the middle we'll get what's good for all of us. But in my view, Steve, we've been a divided country since 200 years. We can't make up our mind. I think we need to focus more on policies, not political parties, but just pure policies of what could do good for our people. What happened last year was pathetic. It was an insult to our country. Never in my lifetime would I have ever dreamed that we would show so much disrespect just because a new president took over that some people weren't happy about. We've never had that problem before. Even in 20 years, we've never had that. So, it's interesting to me. And the other thing, that a comment that was mentioned on the radio the other day that's really bothered me a little bit, is they were talking about, they did an interview with Trump. He's going to be post aired this week. But the comment that was made has really bothered me. They said, Trump has made a comment that China and Russia, the two presidents of China and Russia, both know the game, Biden's game, and they're going to come and take us down. Well, how does he know what those two people know, right? Personally, how does he know? Or is he just assuming? So he has a good way of just throwing things out there and everybody believes it's fact. And we have to be very careful. That's been the problem with all of this from the beginning, the COVID and everything. Everybody was throwing out assumptions without saying this is just an assumption. They were throwing it out as a fact, and you had leaders who could carry that as a fact. But we also learned everything they spewed out, 3 weeks later, it wasn't true. So let's just be very careful. Let's, adjust our ears a little bit and don't listen to everything that's coming from the person you like as 100% fact. I mean, I try to listen to both and kind of draw in to the middle. But what we need to do is we need to change our system. And that needs to start by changing how we vote in primaries. Mm-hmm. Now, to discuss broadband and getting it to the rural areas, a lot of people are not aware of this. And that was a deep dive for me because of the invention I have. To help law enforcement with preventing recidivism. And that patent has passed through. But the broadband, that there's so much of it that exists that we could access. One of the ones is PBS. They own so much bandwidth on their networks everywhere, they don't use it. And so they've actually offered up some of it, I think, to first responder networks and stuff like that. But there's just so much available. And PBS, my God, that signal goes through walls. It goes through steel. It goes through woods and acres of woods. That's a very powerful signal. It goes everywhere into every home. So there's no reason why we cannot find some way to distribute this to the rural and minority communities that need access for education. Because like you and I have learned, and one of the big things I've learned is the greatest gap between poverty and sustainability is education. And the gap in education has been access to it online. So I would like to see that gap close. In certain cities like Chicago, they have taken a very aggressive move towards trying to place devices in areas so that people can get access to the internet via wireless. And I think we just need to do more, because once we do that, we'll have a better grid access to do far better things for first responders and everything else. And, Steve, I'd like to pitch my address back to you for a second and get your feedback on that.
Oh, well, I mean, Kimberly, you just gave a lot of information. I mean, I think first of all, let me address your point. How does President Trump know about what others are doing? It could be conjecture. It could be speculation. We don't know. I mean, at the end of the day, he's no longer the president, and we know the president has access to classified information. There's probably a lot of information we don't know right now. In terms of the conversations he's having with world leaders. And so I don't know, but it's politics. People are going to assume and say whatever. I love your idea about the broadband access and leveraging these great conglomerates, like PBS, in terms of how we provide more access. I think also Department of Transportation, there's a lot of right of way that could be loosened up, and they could spend more role of building in more of the fiber infrastructure that we need so that we can provide more access. It's no different than how President Eisenhower, built millions and millions and millions of miles of highway in the United States, thousands of miles of highway, right? In the 1950s. Well, why couldn't we authorize that and make it easier for local communities to do that. So I hope that answers your question. We could probably have another show on it, but I love your perspective there as an entrepreneur in terms of these
Oh,
issues.
no, she's a great entrepreneur and got some great perspective. I know we're getting ready to wind down. I know another issue that Kimberly is very passionate about, and there's been some speculation about whether there was going to be an uptick in it or a non-uptick, was the whole concept of domestic violence and how we can address that and things along those lines. So don't know, once again, that we'll be able to delve deep into that, but hopefully Kimberly and Mr. Thimick can return and join us again on tomorrow's edition of World Edition, and maybe we can share some of that thoughts in that conversation as well, because I do know that that has been a conversation that's been going out there, as well as the impact, we kind of alluded to it, of social media and things of that nature. So I'm offering, and I think I can do that as the de facto program director and everything, the opportunity for our boss, Kim, to come back. Yes, Kim, I'll just like pull you back in and everything, along with Nick, who I think will be back tomorrow. And Mr. Thimick, if you want to come back, we'd love to
I'll
have
be
you
there.
back as well.
Thank you. I'll be there.
Well, it's been a great. I'm going to go ahead and close out today. First of all, the point of our conversation today is that as we deal with this pandemic, and first of all, Mark, thank you for being on the show as always. We welcome you
Delighted.
back. Um, as we deal with keeping people safe and healthy, there is a trade-off. Reducing the number of infections, balancing that with the impact on society. And I do believe that our children and the future of their schooling and what that means in terms of their preparing for the jobs of the new economy could be at risk the longer we keep them away from in-person school. My final thought of the day, I forgot to mention, we'll talk about it tomorrow. The Department of Defense, a federal judge ruled that the Navy could not be punished for for not forcing people to be vaccinated. And my final thought is I'm thinking about an apple right now because I usually have an apple for lunch with some cheese slices after I work out. But today, the conversation is Apple, the company. I want everyone around the world to know that Apple has just surpassed a landmark valuation of $3 trillion. $3 trillion. This means today, wherever we sit in the world, Apple is a a valuation that is more than the combined value of Walmart, Disney, Netflix, Nike, Exxon Mobil, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, AT&T, Goldman Sachs, Boeing, IBM, and Ford combined. Who would have ever thought 10 to 12 years ago, or even shorter than that, that this vision of Steve Jobs and Apple would be a value of $3 trillion, more than all of these huge behemoths in industry. And it's only the tip of the iceberg. Apple is continuing to do great plans. How do we balance their continued growth and increase in value with the conversation we had on the show about big tech and the potential of monopolies in our industry? We'll be talking about those industries in the future on the show. And tomorrow we'll talk a little bit about redistricting and what's going on with the courts. And in the United States, why are courts playing such a role in our elections and our legislative districts? From our family to yours, we wish you all the best as we kick off this new year. We look forward to the exciting year ahead for Pod TV, IBM TV, and we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow for another edition of World Edition. Thank you all so much. Thank you all. We'll be back tomorrow.